Exciting news in the world of cannibalism is a phrase that's maybe not normal to say out loud. One of the cannibalized remains of the fateful Franklin expedition has been identified, and it tells us a lot about how bad things must have been for the men in their final days. So for those of you who maybe don't keep up with updates concerning cannibalism or 19th century British shipwrecks, recently, archaeologists have used the DNA of some cannibalized remains to determine who was eaten by his crew. But before we get to that, let's quickly review the 1845 doomed Franklin expedition, because we need to know about that, or else the news won't be as exciting as it is for me, clearly. Now, in May of 1845, two ships set out under the command of Captain Sir John Franklin, the Terror and the Erebus. And if the Terror sounds familiar, there was a sci-fi version of the story turned into an AMC series back in 2018. And it was so good. So good. Now, the Terror, captained by Francis Crozier, and the Erebus, sailed by Commander James Fitzjames, had a combined crew of 129 men. Their goal was to find the Northwest Passage, a water route that connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans above the American continents, cutting through today's Canada. This certainly wasn't the first expedition to sail for the passage, nor was it the last, but it was probably the most memorable, or at least the most infamous. Because all 129 men, they died. Never seen again. So, here's the short version of what happened. By the time the Franklin expedition was trying to make a pass through the passage, it was the winter of 1846, which was a particularly cold year. That was the same year that the Donner Party tried to cross the Sierra Nevadas, but got stuck in the snow, and that actually turned out very similarly, now that I think about it. Lots of death. Lots of death and cannibalism. But anyway, by the time the Terror and Erebus made a run for the passage, a good chunk of the waterways were blocked by pack ice, which is thick sea ice not bound by land. It's just kind of free floating around in the waves and the currents. And in the northern regions, pack ice can be a serious problem for ships. If your ship gets stuck in it, or if pack ice forms around your ship, it can lift it out of the water and potentially even crush it, so you won't even be able to sail out when the pack ice recedes. So, facing immense pack ice, Captain Sir John Franklin decided to take a route south to what we now know as King William Island. But at the time it wasn't fully mapped, and it could have very well been a peninsula. In fact, they thought it was a peninsula. So, coming down south, they get to the tip of this island, and the crew are faced with a choice. Do they head left, which is east, and potentially get stuck in a dead-end bay? Or do they head right, which is to the west, and make their way around these labyrinthine channels and find a way out? Well, not having all the information, Sir John Franklin head west around King William Island that he thought was a peninsula. He didn't want to get stuck on the wrong side, right? Like, if he thinks it's a peninsula and he goes into the bay, then what's he gonna do? Just wait? That's not a good idea. But it was an island, and they just didn't know that. But the decision sealed their fate. It didn't take long before both the Terror and the Erebus were stuck in pack ice off the northwestern coast of King William Island. And the worst part is that if he had gone east, he would have avoided the pack ice, found out that it was in fact an island and not a peninsula, sailed around it without difficulty, and likely continued on his way. And he probably would have made it to the Bering Straits and successfully sailed through the Northwest Passage. So, the Terror and the Erebus are both stuck in pack ice. Men started to die off. The information we have is spotty because there were only so many records recovered, but we know that Captain Sir John Franklin died on board his ship at the time. Anyway, at least when it was stuck in pack ice. And we also know from notes left behind in frozen cairns that almost 3 years after they were last spotted heading into the Northwest Passage, Captain Crozier decides to desert the ships and head for King William Island. 104 men of the original 129 were still alive by this point. Can you imagine, though? 3 years stuck on board the ship. Ooh, that's rough. Anyway, to wrap up the story here, none of them made it out alive, but supplies were running low. The tin cans they had that were given to them by the Royal Navy were tainted with lead, which is a whole other story that makes things much worse for everyone, so there was a need for food. And the men became that source of food. We always had evidence of cannibalism. Relief expeditions found what little evidence remained of the crew were able to figure that out based on cut marks on the bones. Some were consumed to try to keep the rest alive. Good old-fashioned survival cannibalism. We also have Inuit accounts that support this. In 1993, 451 bones were recovered from 13 different sailors at a makeshift camp on King William Island. So, survival cannibalism didn't help, though, because it wasn't enough to keep the others alive long enough to get help. And for a long time, we didn't know who was eaten, whose bones were found on the island, or, where the men died. One man had been identified back in 2021, John Gregory, an engineer on the Erebus. And the newest name to this list was the commander of the Erebus himself, James Fitzjames. DNA evidence from 25 living descendants helped prove that some of the bones of the consumed belonged to Commander Fitzjames. So what does that mean for us? Well, one, it's just awesome. But two, and more importantly, it tells us about the breakdown of the Royal Navy in those final days. Now, normally, the 19th century Royal Navy would have been governed by a strict set of rules with a strong emphasis on hierarchy. And on top, of course, was the captain of the whole expedition, Sir John Franklin, and underneath him, the two men in charge of the ships, Francis Crozier and James Fitzjames. So under normal circumstances, you wouldn't expect the men to come anywhere close to eating their commander. But finding clear evidence that he was consumed after his death, he wasn't murdered, he died from illness, that gives us an idea that the hierarchy and rules that strictly governs the Royal Navy and society for England in general clearly no longer applied. Or, as one of Fitzjames's direct descendants, Nigel Gambier, noted, "It makes me realize just how desperate those poor people must have been to go and eat one of their own. How would you know how you'd behave yourself? If you're faced with starvation, then you might be driven to it." End quote. So now that we've identified 2 of the cannibalized remains, I'm hoping it's only a matter of time until we can get some more names. But in the meantime, it's really exciting news in the worlds of history and archaeology that we finally found out what happened to Commander James Fitzjames. He survived for years on board the ships stuck in pack ice. He set across King William Island to try to survive, but then he got sick and died and was consumed by his fellow crew members. What a horrible way to go. Thanks for joining me for this quick history update. My name is Kelly Beard, and if you haven't checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. And be sure to subscribe to watch more gross, disgusting, and weird history, making it more fun and accessible for you.